Hello, I'm Dr. Chiquita Collins. I'm the Associate Vice President for Inclusive Excellence and Health Equity at UT Health San Antonio. Today I will speak to you on clinical trials and bias and the Latino experience. So a few questions I would like to pose before we really get started here. And the first is, what barriers have you encountered based on your identity? The second question, what solutions have you developed to address these barriers? And number three, does a diverse biomedical workforce translate into greater participation in clinical trials? Now, I think it's important for us to take a pause and really talk about diversity. Diversity here in the United States. Unless you live under a rock, you are fully aware that we're becoming more diverse than ever. In fact, the U.S. Census Bureau reported this past spring that in 2050, that underrepresented groups, which includes Blacks, African Americans, Native Americans, Native Hawaiians, and other Pacific Islanders, are going to have the largest representation. As you see from the slide here, if we were to look at past history, this shows the extent to which you have interaction with someone who is different from yourself. And what it illustrates is back in 1960, we see pretty much a prevalence as pertains to southern states. And that really is related to the interaction between African Americans and whites. In 2010, you see this map illustrates where the color blue becomes more pronounced, which illustrates that there is more, I would say, propensity to interact with individuals different from yourself as pertains to race and ethnicity. You see that the map shows that along the southwestern border, you see this to be more pronounced. And again, in 2060, in terms of what is projected, that you see for the majority, most states across the United States, you see a higher propensity in terms of interaction with individuals who are different from yourself as it pertains to race and ethnicity. Now, as it pertains to the Hispanic population, here currently it shows in terms of what has been pretty much prevalent in 2017, and it shows you a trajectory in terms of what's expected for the Hispanic, Latino, Latinx population. And you see here in 2020, they roughly represent 19% of the population. But by 2060, they will actually increase to 28%. Now, keep in mind that those percentages vary depending on geographic location. Here we're situated in San Antonio, where 63% of adults self-identify as either Hispanic, Latino, or Latinx. So this graph illustrates what I just alluded to as pertains to the percentage of adults who identify as Latino or Hispanic here in San Antonio. It also provides other groups as it pertains to race and ethnicity, and you see those numbers illustrated in this slide here. Now, I think it's important to also emphasize what does underrepresentation mean. And so as it pertains to underrepresentation, it's usually groups who have historically been, I would say, limited to opportunity. And as pertains to race and ethnicity, they tend to be those that are illustrated here. Blacks or African Americans, Hispanics or Latinos, American Indians or Alaska Native Hawaiians, and other Pacific Islanders. That also include groups who would be under the rubric of being marginalized or vulnerable, and also includes women. This graph really depicts the extent to which there is a lifetime probability of developing or dying from invasive cancer among Hispanic populations and non-Hispanic populations. And the risk of being diagnosed with cancer increases with age because most cancers require many years to develop. Hispanic men and women are less likely to be diagnosed with cancer than non-Hispanic whites overall, although risk varies by cancer type, as you see illustrated in this table here. About 1 in 3 Hispanic men and women will be diagnosed with cancer in their lifetime, while the lifetime probability of dying from cancer among Hispanics is about 1 in 5 for men and 1 in 6 for women. Unlike non-Hispanic whites, cancer is the leading cause of death among Hispanics, accounting for 21% of deaths back in 2016 in terms of the most recent data. Now, I think, as it pertains to how do we mitigate bias, this is the intent of this presentation, I want to talk about 2 in particular. First is the extent to which there is gender bias. And there's a lot of studies to illustrate this, but I really want to hone in terms of emphasizing the extent to which there's gender bias in clinical trials. I'm not sure if you're aware, but I think it's important to bring to your attention that the National Institutes of Health Revitalization Act of 1993, signed into law on June 10th, 1993, directed the National Institute of Health to establish guidelines for inclusion of women and minorities in clinical research. In 2001, the NIH issued the NIH Policy and Guidelines on the Inclusion of Women and Minorities as Subjects in Clinical Research. Those are two documents that I would highly recommend in terms of just using as a reference guide and understanding the extent to which there is emphasis to increase diversity as pertains to clinical trials. Now, the second type of bias is really related to racial and ethnic bias, and there is a plethora of studies to document the extent to which biases occur within racial and ethnic groups. One in particular in which I like to illustrate is that back in 2008, in which we had the horrific Katrina hurricane that plummeted New Orleans, and it was devastating in terms of impacting certain populations. But I want to show you that this slide really depicts the extent to which it has actually been conveyed in national news outlets. As you see here, there is a photograph on the top illustrating, looks to me, from my perception, an African American or a black person wading in water with a large garbage bag. And I'm just going to read to you in terms of what it says in the caption here. It reads, "A young man walks through chest-deep flood water after looting." I circle the word looting to emphasize in terms of what is described here. The second photograph on the bottom of this slide here illustrates two individuals, and from my perception, they are persons of color, white individuals, and they actually illustrate a similar dynamic. They're wading in water with large garbage bags. However, the caption that's read in this national news outlet states, "Two residents wade through chest-deep water after finding bread and soda." I circle the word finding to illustrate to you that even with the language that is used, the photograph on the top criminalizes the extent to which that person is seen in terms of wading in water with a garbage bag. And we can only imagine that this person is also seeking food for survival. And we see the depiction in terms of a similar photograph in which we don't use words that can be criminalized in that extent. So my point being is that there is a degree to which the social media has been literally seen as a perpetrator in terms of social, I would say, stereotypes that are very prevalent in our society today. Okay? So they're seen as the biggest culprit in perpetuating stereotypes. Now I want to shift gears back to the conversation at hand as pertains to clinical trial participation and barriers that may impact Latino patients. Okay? One being is that there is a greater fear of uncertainty over experimental treatment efficacy. Second, there is the extent to which there can be poor communications with doctor and towards the patient. And lastly, there is oftentimes, in terms of what's documented in the literature, there's a poor understanding of the purpose of the clinical trial. So to what extent are some of the known barriers that may disproportionately impact Latino patient enrollment in clinical trials? Well, there is a host that has been documented in the scientific literature, and I'm just going to name a few. In fact, there is the extent to which there is a lack of clinical awareness. There's a level of comfort explaining the clinical trial in terms of discomfort. There is a fear of losing patients from the perspective of physicians. Oftentimes they are working in under-resourced clinics, so they have limited resources for data management. There is the degree to which they are concerned about their patient's age and comorbid conditions. There is the extent to which there's awareness of and lack of adequate compensation for involvement. And last but not least, we cannot ignore the extent to which there is a legacy of mistrust of the medical system and researchers as pertains to marginalized and communities of color. So what type of clinical trials has been illustrated in the scientific literature as pertains to Latino physicians and the degree to which they enroll patients? Well, this is in a rank order, and this is actually drawn from Dr. Amelie Ramirez, who oversees Salud America. And the four that are illustrated here indicate that screening and diagnostic trials is by far I would say, most popular clinical trial by which Latino physicians enroll their patients. The second are treatment trials. Third, prevention action studies, which is largely behavioral modification. And last but not least are prevention agent studies, which is linked to the need for chemotherapy. Other studies have documented there is the extent to which oftentimes patients encounter language proficiency and literacy that often deters the extent to which their involvement or enrollment in clinical trials, and so that is something of importance to mention. Another key component is the extent to which informed consent process can be kind of misinformed or not fully understood, primarily among underrepresented populations. Many participants are misinformed about research. Many have incomplete comprehension of information specific to research studies in which they are involved. And so there is a need to have more clarity, language that is understood, and oftentimes in terms of the scientific literature, they say you should aim for language for someone who's in the third grade to make it easily understood and the ability to agree to signing up for clinical trials and the like. Now, I think it's important to talk about unconscious bias, often termed implicit bias. Obviously, the preponderance of social stereotypes about certain groups are very rampant in our society. Sometimes we see it to the extent to which it can lead to professional behavior, and there is a plethora of studies to document that biases are pretty much prevalent irrespective of who you are. I identify myself as an African American woman, and even though I would say I'm the most egalitarian person that you will ever meet, I have biases too. So the reality is that everyone has biases. Now, just because you have biases does not equate to any of the negative, I would say, connotations that are set forth in our society. So having an implicit bias towards a particular racial ethnic group does not imply that you are a racist. And so I think that's important to emphasize. Okay? Now, there is a tool that has been used, been created by Dr. Banerjee from Harvard University, who's a social psychologist, and it's called Implicit Association Test. And I would say that it's easy to actually take advantage of this tool. It's really to increase awareness, not necessarily saying that it's going to change behavior per se, but again, in terms of increasing your consciousness as it pertains to the extent to which you may have certain biases. It's entitled Project Implicit, and again, I can share the link in terms of getting access to this particular tool, and it's been used in over 5,000 studies. There are over 13 IATs, or implicit association tests, by which you can take part in. I always encourage, as pertains to various types of decision-making committees, to take part in the race IAT. There are 2 gender IATs, and there are others, as you see, in terms of when you have the opportunity to peruse. What you will find is an image by which it will come very quickly. It starts off slow and then it speeds up, and you have to use your index finger of each hand to ascribe a certain adjective to that imagery. And again, you'll see that it starts off slow and then it picks up in terms of speed. And at the end of this test, it will generate a summary of your tendencies as it pertains to the biases that you have displayed. I often get that people question the efficacy of this test itself, but again, it's important to emphasize that the test, the implicit association test, really is the opportunity, is used as a tool to increase your awareness in terms of the extent to which you may have biases. So that's the first course, I would say, opportunity to really try to address and mitigate biases, is to know if you have them. I've mentioned this in the course of the presentation. There's a plethora of studies, primarily in the social science, that has illustrated that biases really impact the way in which we judge people, the way in which we recruit and hire as pertains to the admissions of students. And so, again, I can, if interested, direct you to some of those resources as it pertains to scholarship. There are different types of biases in the social psychology literature. One is referenced as it pertains to affinity bias, and that is the tendency to feel comfortable among others who you have certain commonalities, right? And so there's that is quite pervasive. And again, we tend to, with anyone, whether we are, irrespective of age, we tend to gravitate towards individuals in which we have certain commonalities. So that's one in which it is quite prevalent in the literature as well. A second type of bias is pertaining to the halo effect. And that implies the tendency to think everything about a particular person is good, irrespective of any type of display of unprofessional behavior. You always see that person in a favorable light, and you often provide, the tendency to offer excuses to kind of not, be judgmental about that person's character. All right, so that's another type of bias that has been illustrated in the social psychology literature. There are other types, such as perception bias, and that is the tendency to form stereotypes and assumptions about certain groups that make it impossible to make an objective judgment about members of those groups. There is confirmation bias, which implies the tendency for people to seek information that confirms pre-existing beliefs or assumptions. And then again, there's one in which some of us are fully aware, and that is pertaining to what we call groupthink. And that is the bias which occurs when people try too hard to fit into a particular group by mimicking others or holding back thoughts and opinions. This causes them to lose part of their identities and causes organizations to lose out on creativity and innovation. Now, it's important to, have some skill set in terms of ways or methods by which we can mitigate these biases. And I'm just offering a few here, and I look forward to our Q&A session. And this is the extent to which we, as we kind of, interact with individuals who are different from ourselves, we have to allow, less speaking time in terms of, trying to listen versus always taking control of conversations. There is what has been, I would say, conveyed in the literature that you have to often be reluctant to use impromptu social comments. Again, this is more in terms of the dyad between a clinician and a patient, to have less positive interactions in a way in which you are just being more conscientious in terms of putting yourself in that person's shoes. And of course, we always say, the golden rule, treat others as if you would like to be treated. And so there is, some evidence to that as well. Other strategies to neutralize or mitigate implicit bias is the extent to which you can ask patient questions about their interests and activities that you share in common. Focus on shared common identity between you and your patient. You can take the perception in terms of perspective thinking or taking, and that really implies take the perception or perspective of a member of the group against which you have the unconscious bias. So put yourself in that person's shoes, in which I alluded to a few minutes ago. Consider the opposite. When data seem to point to one conclusion, briefly look for data supporting the opposite conclusion before making a decision. And last but not least, have counter stereotypic exemplars. Spend time with or focus on individuals you admire from groups against which you have a bias towards. So I will conclude this presentation, and again, we'll open up for questions and answers as we have more engagement in pertaining to clinical trials and bias. Thank you.